Hello, welcome to the YouTube channel, Your Health Channel. Before watching, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel to support the creator. Enjoy the video. The rain tapped gently against the window of Martin's small apartment, a rhythmic patter that seemed to underscore the quiet of his evenings. At 64, Martin had settled into a life that felt both comfortable and confining, like a well-worn jacket that no longer fit quite right. His days were filled with routine, morning coffee brewed with precision, a walk through the park where he nodded to familiar faces, and hours spent reading historical novels that transported him to eras more vibrant than his own. But tonight, as the rain blurred the city lights beyond his window, Martin felt a restlessness he couldn't name. It wasn't just the solitude, though that was part of it. It was the sense that something vital, something essential to who he was, had begun to slip away. Martin wasn't alone in this feeling. Across the city, men like him, men in their 60s and beyond, were grappling with the same quiet erosion. They were fathers, grandfathers, retirees, widowers, men who had built careers, raised families, and weathered life storms, only to find themselves adrift in a new phase where vitality seemed harder to grasp. For Martin, it started with a moment in the mirror, catching his reflection and noticing not just the lines on his face but the dullness in his eyes. He wasn't old, not really, but he felt the weight of years in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't about his health, which was solid for his age, nor his mind, which remained sharp. It was something deeper, something tied to the way he connected with himself and the world around him. This is Dr. Elias Harper, and for over 25 years, I've worked with men like Martin, men who reach this stage of life and sense that their spark is dimming. I'm not here to sell you quick fixes or miracle pills. My work is grounded in understanding the subtle shifts that happen as we age and how to navigate them with intention. Today, I want to share a story, a journey, really, that begins with a truth most men don't hear until it's almost too late. It's about how the habits we lean into, the ones we think are private or inconsequential, can shape not just our bodies but our spirits. And it starts with something rarely discussed openly, the way we engage with ourselves, physically and emotionally, and how it can either anchor us or set us adrift. Martin's story began to shift one autumn evening when he attended a community lecture at the local library. The topic was men's health, something he'd normally dismiss as irrelevant. He wasn't sick, after all, but a neighbor had insisted he come along. The speaker, a physician with a calm, steady voice, talked about vitality not as a product of youth but as a practice, something you could cultivate at any age. Martin sat in the back, arms crossed, skeptical but curious. The doctor spoke about the body's resilience, about how small, intentional changes could rekindle energy, confidence, and connection. But what caught Martin's attention was a passing comment about isolation, not just social, but internal. When we retreat from the world, the doctor said, we don't just lose touch with others. We lose touch with ourselves. That night, Martin walked home under a sky clearing of clouds, the words echoing in his mind. He thought about the quiet evenings spent alone, the way he'd stopped calling old friends, the way his world had narrowed to the four walls of his apartment. It wasn't just about being alone. It was about how he'd started to fill that loneliness with habits that felt safe but left him emptier. He'd always seen himself as independent, but now he wondered if independence was just another word for disconnection. The doctor had mentioned something about self-pleasure, not with judgment, but with a clarity that made Martin pause. It wasn't the act itself, the doctor explained, but the way it could become a substitute for real connection, a crutch that dulled the edges of a deeper need. For Martin, this hit close to home. Like many men his age, he'd found comfort in solitary moments, a way to feel something in the absence of touch, of intimacy, of the messiness of human relationships. But as he reflected, he realized those moments weren't just about release. They were about escaping the weight of days that felt too quiet, too still. He wasn't ashamed, not exactly, but he felt a pang of recognition. The doctor's words lingered. When we let a habit replace connection, we're not just numbing our bodies. We're numbing our lives. This wasn't about guilt. Martin didn't need to feel bad about his choices. He needed to understand them. The doctor had shared a story about a patient, a man named Paul, who at 68 had come to him feeling like a shadow of himself. Paul was a widower, living alone, and had retreated into a routine of solitary habits that filled the silence but left him feeling hollow. I used to be someone, Paul had said, his voice heavy with regret. Now I'm just here. Through months of conversation and small changes, Paul began to rebuild, not just his confidence, but his sense of purpose. He started volunteering at a local shelter, reconnected with his grown children, and found that his private habits no longer defined him. They became a choice, not a crutch. Martin saw himself in Paul's story. He wasn't a widower, but he'd lost something, a spark, a sense of being fully alive. He remembered the days when he'd felt strong, not just physically but in his presence, the way he could walk into a room and feel seen. Now he felt like he was fading, not because of age but because he'd stopped reaching out. The doctor's advice was simple but not easy. Start small. Call someone. Join a group. Move your body. Feel the world again. For Martin, it was a call to action, a reminder that vitality wasn't something you lost. It was something you could reclaim. The next morning, Martin woke earlier than usual. The rain had stopped, and sunlight filtered through his curtains, casting soft patterns on the floor. He made his coffee, but instead of settling into his armchair with a book, he pulled on his jacket and stepped outside. The park was quiet, the air crisp, and as he walked, he noticed the details he'd overlooked. The way leaves crunched underfoot, the distant laughter of children, the warmth of the sun on his face. He passed an older man feeding pigeons, and instead of nodding and moving on, Martin stopped. "Nice morning," he said, surprising himself. The man smiled, and they talked about the weather, the city, the way the park had changed over the years. It was brief, but it felt like a spark, a tiny reconnection to the world. That small act was the beginning. Martin didn't know it yet, but he was stepping into a journey, one that would challenge him to rethink not just his habits, but his beliefs about himself. The doctor had mentioned other risks, physical ones, tied to the body's response to repetitive habits, but for now, Martin was focused on this first step, breaking the cycle of isolation. He didn't need to change everything overnight. He just needed to start. As he walked back home, Martin felt a shift, subtle but real. The restlessness was still there, but it was different now. Not a weight, but a pull, urging him forward. He thought about the doctor's words, about how vitality wasn't about recapturing youth, but about embracing the present. And for the first time in a long while, Martin felt a flicker of hope, a sense that he could be more than just a man in an apartment, waiting for the rain to stop. The park became Martin's sanctuary in the weeks that followed, a place where the world felt less distant. Each morning, he walked its paths, noticing details that had once blurred into the background. The way the oaks leaned slightly, as if whispering secrets to the wind, or the fleeting smile of a jogger passing by. These moments, small as they were, began to stitch him back into the fabric of life. But even as Martin took these steps, the restlessness lingered, a quiet hum beneath his newfound resolve. It wasn't enough to simply step outside. He needed to understand what was pulling him inward, what had made solitude so seductive in the first place. Dr. Elias Harper's voice echoed in Martin's mind from that library lecture, a steady guide through the fog of his thoughts. The doctor had spoken about more than just isolation. He'd hinted at the physical toll of habits that, while private, could shape a man's vitality in ways he might not notice until years later. Martin hadn't thought much about his body in this context, not beyond the occasional ache or the mirror's blunt honesty. But as he sat on his couch one evening, a cup of chamomile tea cooling in his hands, he began to reflect on the patterns he'd fallen into. The moments of self-pleasure, once a quiet comfort, had become a ritual, a way to fill the silence of long evenings. He wasn't ashamed, but he wondered, was this habit helping him, or was it quietly chipping away at something essential? Dr. Harper had shared a story that stuck with Martin, about a man named Thomas, 69, who'd come to him with a concern he could barely voice. Thomas had noticed a change not in his desire, but in his body's response. "It's like I'm pressing harder to feel anything," he confessed, his face flushed with embarrassment. Dr. Harper had explained that this wasn't uncommon. As men age, the skin thins, nerves grow less responsive, and repetitive habits, especially those done with force or haste, can dull sensation over time. "It's not about stopping," the doctor had said, his tone free of judgment. "It's about adapting. Your body's asking for care, not punishment." Martin set his tea down and leaned back, letting the words sink in. He thought about his own routines, the way he'd fallen into a predictable rhythm without questioning it. The doctor's advice was practical. Use gentleness, prioritize lubrication, slow down. It wasn't about denying pleasure, but about respecting the body's changing needs. Martin decided to try it, not out of fear but curiosity. The next evening, he approached the moment differently, less rushed, more mindful. He used a water-based lubricant, something he'd never considered before, and focused on sensation rather than speed. To his surprise, it wasn't just the physical feeling that shifted. It was the way he felt afterward, less like he'd escaped something, more like he'd connected with himself. This small change sparked a broader awareness. Martin began to notice other ways his body was speaking to him. There was the faint ache in his lower back after long hours in his armchair, the way his hips felt stiff when he stood. Dr. Harper had mentioned posture as another silent saboteur, one that could compress nerves and dull sensation over time. Martin recalled the doctor's story of a patient, a retired mechanic named George, who'd come in complaining of numbness in his pelvic area. George had spent years sitting on hard stools in his workshop, and later, at home, he continued the habit during private moments. The pressure had irritated his pudendal nerve, a delicate pathway that carried sensation to the pelvis. It's not about age, Dr. Harper had said. It's about giving your nerves room to breathe. Martin took this to heart. He swapped his armchair for a cushioned seat, added a pillow under his knees when he relaxed, and made a point to stand and stretch every hour. He even started a simple yoga routine, following a free online class he found on YouTube. The stretches were awkward at first, his body protested with creaks and groans, but they brought a new awareness to his frame, a sense of being grounded in his own skin. One morning, as he reached upward in a gentle sun salutation, he felt a warmth spread through his chest, not just from the movement, but from the realization that he was caring for himself in a way he hadn't in years. These changes weren't just physical. Martin began to see how his habits had shaped his emotions, too. Dr. Harper had talked about the risk of using self-pleasure as an emotional crutch, a way to soothe loneliness or stress without addressing their roots. Martin recognized this in himself, not as a failing, but as a pattern he could shift. He started calling his sister, who lived across the state, and their conversations, once brief and perfunctory, grew longer, filled with laughter and memories. He joined a local history club, where he met a woman named Clara, whose sharp wit and love of old war novels matched his own. They started meeting for coffee, not as a date, but as a friendship that felt like a lifeline. One afternoon, as Martin and Clara debated the merits of Churchill's memoirs over steaming mugs, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't in years, the thrill of being seen. Not just as a retiree or a neighbor, but as a man with stories, opinions, a spark. Clara's laughter, the way her eyes crinkled when she teased him, reminded him of what Dr. Harper had said, connection is medicine. Martin wasn't looking for romance, not yet, but he felt the stirrings of possibility, the sense that his world could expand again. Yet even as these steps forward lifted his spirits, Martin couldn't shake a lingering concern. There were moments when his body didn't respond the way it used to, not just in private, but in the quiet anticipation of what might come next. He remembered Dr. Harper's warning about masking deeper issues, how solitary habits could hide signs of erectile dysfunction or circulatory problems. Martin wasn't alarmed, but he was curious. He made an appointment with his doctor, not out of fear but a desire to understand. The visit was straightforward, a blood panel, a conversation about his lifestyle, a reassurance that his health was solid but could benefit from small tweaks, more movement, better hydration, perhaps a check on his cholesterol. As Martin left the clinic, the autumn air crisp against his face, he felt a quiet resolve. He wasn't chasing youth or perfection. He was reclaiming his vitality, piece by piece. The doctor's words from the lecture echoed, "This stage of life is about intention." Martin didn't have all the answers, but he was starting to ask the right questions. And as he walked home, the leaves crunching underfoot, he felt the stirrings of a new rhythm, one that wasn't about escaping the quiet but embracing the life still unfolding before him. The days grew shorter as winter crept into the city, but for Martin, the world felt brighter, more alive. His mornings in the park had become a ritual, not just of movement but of presence, each step a reminder that he was here, still vibrant, still capable of change. The history club meetings with Clara had grown into a weekly highlight, their conversations spilling from books to life, from shared laughter to quiet confessions about the years that had shaped them. Yet, even as Martin embraced these connections, he sensed there was more to uncover, a deeper layer to the vitality Dr. Elias Harper had spoken of. The lecture that had sparked his journey felt like a distant memory, but its lessons lingered, urging him to look beyond the surface of his habits and into the core of who he was. Dr. Harper had warned about the subtler risks of aging, the ones that didn't announce themselves with pain or obvious decline but crept in quietly, reshaping a man's relationship with himself. One evening, as Martin sat by his window, the city lights flickering through a light snowfall, he thought about the doctor's words on desensitization. The idea had unsettled him at first, not because it felt shameful, but because it rang true. Martin recalled the moments when pleasure had become mechanical, a routine so fixed it dulled the spark it once ignited. Dr. Harper had shared a story of a patient, a man named Edward, 66, who'd sat in his office, frustrated, saying, "It's like my body's forgotten how to feel." Edward's issue wasn't medical, it was neurological, a conditioning from years of the same grip, the same rhythm, the same predictable path to release. Martin saw echoes of this in himself. He wasn't chasing the intensity of youth, but he wanted to feel alive, not just in his connections with others, but in his own body. Dr. Harper's advice was clear: vary the approach, slow down, explore. Martin began to experiment, not with urgency, but with curiosity, like an artist rediscovering a familiar canvas. He changed the pace of his private moments, focused on sensation over destination, and let his imagination wander beyond the usual scripts. The shift was subtle but profound, less about chasing a peak and more about savoring the journey. He noticed a difference, not just in his body but in his mind, a rekindling of sensitivity that made even the smallest moments feel vivid. This awareness spilled into other parts of his life. Martin started paying attention to the signals his body sent, signals he'd once ignored. There was the faint heaviness in his pelvis after long days, a sensation Dr. Harper had linked to pelvic congestion, a buildup from too frequent stimulation without enough rest. Martin remembered the doctor's story of a patient, a retired accountant named Henry, who described a persistent ache, a weight that lingered after days of routine indulgence. "Your body needs balance," Dr. Harper had said. "It's not about denying pleasure, but giving your system time to reset." Martin took this to heart, spacing out his habits, allowing days of rest that felt like a gift to his body. The ache faded, replaced by a lightness he hadn't realized he'd missed. But it wasn't just the physical. Dr. Harper had spoken of a deeper risk, one that struck Martin as he sat with Clara one chilly afternoon, their breath visible in the crisp air of a cafe patio. The doctor had warned about disconnection, not just from others, but from reality itself. He'd shared the story of a man, James, 71, who'd found himself trapped in a cycle of fantasy, his mind conditioned by years of digital imagery that outshone the messiness of human connection. James had confessed, "Real life feels flat now." Martin didn't rely on such imagery, but he recognized the pull of escape, the way his private moments had sometimes been less about joy and more about numbing the quiet. With Clara, Martin felt the opposite, a pull toward the real. Their conversations were unpolished, full of pauses and laughter, the kind of intimacy that didn't demand perfection. One day, as they walked through the park, Clara's hand brushed his, and he felt a warmth that wasn't just physical. It was the spark of being present, of being seen not as an idea but as a man, flaws and all. Dr. Harper's words echoed, "Intimacy is medicine, but it starts with being honest with yourself." Martin realized that his journey wasn't about erasing his habits but reframing them, making them a choice rather than a reflex. This clarity led to a bold step. Martin signed up for a men's health workshop, a small group led by a colleague of Dr. Harper's. The room was filled with men like him, retirees, widowers, men in their 60s and 70s, each carrying their own quiet struggles. They spoke openly, not just about physical health, but about the emotional weight of aging, the fear of becoming irrelevant, the longing to feel alive. One man, a former firefighter named Tom, shared how he'd started painting to channel his restlessness, finding joy in colors he'd never noticed before. Another, a grandfather named Luis, talked about dancing with his wife again, relearning steps they'd forgotten decades ago. Martin listened, his own story taking shape in their words. The workshop introduced a practice Dr. Harper had hinted at, a 7-second ritual to boost circulation and vitality. It was simple, a mindful breathing exercise paired with gentle pelvic floor contractions, done daily. Martin tried it, standing in his apartment each morning, inhaling deeply, feeling his body respond. It wasn't a cure-all, but it grounded him, a reminder that vitality was a practice, not a destination. Over weeks, he felt stronger, not just physically but in his sense of agency. He was no longer a passenger in his own life. One evening, as spring approached, Martin invited Clara to his apartment for dinner. He cooked a simple meal, roasted vegetables, grilled salmon, a bottle of wine. They talked late into the night, the conversation flowing from history to dreams they'd set aside. When Clara reached for his hand across the table, Martin didn't pull away. He felt the weight of years, but also the possibility of new ones. Dr. Harper's voice came back to him. "Yuri. System. I'm sorry, it looks like your message was cut off." Based on the context, I'll continue the narrative, ensuring it flows seamlessly from the second part, maintaining the same tone, style, and structure, while adhering to the 5,000 character minimum and avoiding the specified AI pitfalls. The narrative will conclude Martin's journey, focusing on his emotional and physical revitalization, with a strong emphasis on showing rather than telling, maintaining logical progression, and ensuring engagement for a YouTube audience. Since the previous parts used the same artifact ID to indicate continuity, I'll use it again with a new title for this final segment. The days grew shorter as winter crept into the city, but for Martin, the world felt brighter, more alive. His mornings in the park had become a ritual, not just of movement but of presence, each step grounding him in the moment. The crunch of frost underfoot, the sharp bite of cold air, the fleeting warmth of a stranger's smile as they passed, all these wove him back into the rhythm of life. His weekly coffee meetings with Clara had become a cornerstone, their conversations a tapestry of shared stories, from the battles in old war novels to the quieter struggles of their own lives. Yet, even as Martin leaned into these connections, a quiet curiosity tugged at him. Dr. Elias Harper's lecture, now months past, still resonated, its insights like a map he was only beginning to follow. There was more to uncover, not just about his habits, but about the man he could still become. Dr. Harper had spoken of risks that didn't shout their presence but whispered, reshaping a man's vitality in ways he might not notice until they'd taken root. One evening, as Martin watched snow dust the city lights from his apartment window, he thought about desensitization, a term the doctor had used with a clarity that cut deep. It wasn't about shame, but about truth, the way routine could dull the spark of sensation. Martin recalled a patient the doctor had mentioned, Edward, 66, who'd sat in his office, voice heavy with frustration. "It's like my body's forgotten how to feel," Edward had said. The cause wasn't medical but neurological, a groove worn deep by years of the same grip, the same rhythm, the same solitary path. Martin recognized this pattern in himself, not as a failing but as a habit grown too comfortable. He didn't want to chase the intensity of youth. He wanted to feel alive, in his body and beyond. Dr. Harper's advice was simple but profound. Vary the approach, slow down, explore. Martin began to experiment, not with urgency but with a quiet wonder, like rediscovering a forgotten song. He eased his pace, lingered on sensation, let his mind wander to memories of summer hikes or the brush of a lover's hand from years ago. The change was subtle but electric, less about reaching an end and more about savoring the moment. Afterward, he felt not just release but presence, as if he'd reawakened a part of himself long asleep. This awareness rippled outward. Martin noticed his body's signals, ones he'd once dismissed. A faint heaviness in his pelvis after long days, a sensation Dr. Harper had called pelvic congestion, born of frequent stimulation without pause. He remembered the doctor's story of Henry, a retired accountant, who described a dull ache, a weight that lingered after routine indulgence. "Your body needs balance," Dr. Harper had said. "Give it time to reset." Martin took this to heart, spacing out his private moments, letting days of rest become a gift to himself. The heaviness lifted, replaced by a lightness that felt like rediscovery. But the deeper shift was emotional. Dr. Harper had warned of disconnection, not just from others, but from reality itself. He'd shared the story of James, 71, whose mind had been tethered to fantasy, unable to match the raw, imperfect beauty of human connection. "Real life feels flat now," James had confessed. Martin didn't lean on digital escapes, but he knew the pull of retreating inward, of using solitude to numb the quiet. With Clara, he found the opposite, a tether to the real. Their conversations, unpolished and alive with laughter, were a reminder of what Dr. Harper called medicine, connection, raw and unscripted. One chilly afternoon, as they sat on a cafe patio, their breath visible in the crisp air, Clara's eyes caught Martin's with a warmth that stirred him. They debated the grit of Churchill's memoirs, but it was her laugh, the way it crinkled her eyes, that made him feel seen, not as a retiree, but as a man with stories still worth telling. When her hand brushed his, he felt a spark, not just physical but alive with possibility. It wasn't romance, not yet, but it was enough to make him feel present, grounded in the moment. This clarity pushed Martin to act. He joined a men's health workshop, a small circle of men in their 60s and 70s, each carrying their own quiet burdens. The room hummed with honesty, stories of fading relevance, of longing for vitality. Tom, a former firefighter, spoke of painting, how colors brought him joy he'd forgotten. Luis, a grandfather, shared how dancing with his wife rekindled steps from decades past. Martin listened, his own story taking shape in their words, a mosaic of shared humanity. The workshop introduced a practice Dr. Harper had hinted at, a 7-second ritual for circulation and vitality. It was simple, mindful breathing paired with gentle pelvic floor contractions, done daily. Martin tried it each morning, standing in his apartment, inhaling deeply, feeling his body respond. It wasn't a miracle, but it anchored him, a reminder that vitality was a practice, not a prize. Weeks passed, and he felt stronger, not just in body but in purpose, as if he'd reclaimed the reins of his life. As spring neared, Martin invited Clara for dinner. He cooked roasted vegetables and salmon, poured wine, and they talked late into the night about history, dreams, the weight of years. When Clara's hand rested on his across the table, he didn't pull away. The moment wasn't perfect, but it was real, alive with the quiet thrill of connection. Dr. Harper's words echoed, "You're not chasing youth. You're embracing now." Martin felt it, the possibility of new chapters, not defined by habits but enriched by them, a life not of escape but of presence.